Hey, y'all, welcome to the next episode of Where's Congress? A feature of Good Authority, your go-to site for analysis of politics and political science. I'm John Sides, professor at Vanderbilt University. Joining me, as always, is the Congress Whisperer, Sarah Binder, professor at George Washington University and senior fellow with the Brookings Institute. Today, Sarah and I are going to talk about what our president calls the big, beautiful bill. Sarah, what is the big, beautiful bill that President Trump is asking for?
Well, first, hey, thanks for having me back. But also, where's Congress? They're back. I mean, in a Congress sort of way, they're actually doing something. What is the big, beautiful bill? We'll go up a little altitude and then we'll come down to the weeds. Not too weedy, I promise. The congressional budget law since the 1970s has had a process we call reconciliation, had a different use originally, but today and over the last several decades, the majority party, when they control the House, Senate, and the White House, they find this reconciliation process and they understand if you follow all the nitpicky rules, you can't be filibustered. And so it is a gift to majority parties, and they have stretched it over time. So while it might have originally been a little cleanup measure in the congressional budget process to make sure that the balance of revenues and spending stays consistent with the budget, today, Republicans use it to cut taxes, increasing the deficit, and Democrats use it to expand social welfare programs. So what is the big, beautiful bill? This is the Republican version of it. It is based on the last time Republicans had unified party control with President Trump, 2017, 2018. They tried to repeal the Affordable Care Act with it, majority vote, didn't work. You all remember John McCain, thumbs down, killing the Senate version. Then they used reconciliation end of 2017 to cut taxes, the big tax cuts.
Right.
So because of the rules of the game, tax cuts typically, when you use reconciliation, they expire. They expire within what we call the 10-year budget window.
Right.
So this is where we are. They had that bill cost added originally, they thought $1.5 trillion to the deficit. There were some pay-fors, as we call it, trying to offset with new revenues. But now those tax cuts are about to expire at the end of 2025, the way they wrote the bill.
Right.
So nobody really wants taxes to go up, so Republicans are constructing the big, beautiful bill.
So is the big, beautiful bill, this reconciliation package, can be filibustered, it can pass with only Republican votes. Is this also intended to basically fund the government? Because aren't we coming up on the expiration of the current government funding bill?
Yes and no. Usually the answer is no. This time around, we have yes and no. Why the no part? What we think of going into reconciliation is what we call mandatory spending. Federal budget, say $6 to $7 trillion. About a third of it is what we call discretionary spending. Every year, what do we give to the EPA? What do we give to the national parks? What do we spend on defense? What do we spend on various other programs? Every year, Congress has to uses its power of the purse to give a year's worth of funding for those programs. On reconciliation, in addition to changing the tax code, oftentimes it's addressed to what we call mandatory spending or entitlements, right? Medicare, Medicaid, not Social Security for all other reasons, welfare. What's different this time, which is why I said yes and no, is the move by Republicans, building on something Democrats were doing in 2021 when they did reconciliation, is to find money that's normally through the discretionary side, the annual appropriations bills, where you can filibuster, and so it's typically bipartisan. But what they've done is to take spending that's typically appropriations and transformed it into what they call mandatory. They write a new law, put the entitlement to law. So where do we see it? Immigration, many billions for border security. So I think upwards of 100+ billion, which is unheard of for border security, and for defense in particular, right? $100+ billion for increased defense spending, taking it out of the bipartisan process and sticking it into reconciliation. It's short-lived over the life of the bill there, but it gives the majority party the power to decide immigration and defense when normally that's a bipartisan process.
But so there will need to be a separate process, though, for spending decisions on other areas that are not being smuggled into the reconciliation bill. So, for example, so Trump just proposed all these budget cuts to all these different agencies, which he did in his first term as well. And so Congress has to decide, do we not want to fund scientific research to the extent that, Trump wants to cut it? That'll have to be handled separately.
For sure. So that process, the president always proposes a budget. It's typically dead on arrival when it comes to Congress because presidents have priorities, oftentimes big steep cuts, Oliver Reagan and so forth, big steep cuts that members of Congress just don't want to cut, whether it's environmental protection, literacy programs, low-income housing vouchers,
right.
So on and so on. That pet project in the district. Susan Collins from Maine, there's like certain military installations. She wants to be the one to make those decisions. And so it's rare that Congress might take a little bit from a president's budget, but they write their own budget. They write their own spending bills. And that's what is actually going on. House, certainly on the Senate side, I don't know about the House side, Senate side, are having appropriations hearings, hearing from the administration about their spending priorities. And then conceptually, October 1, the start of the fiscal year, they would conceptually put those bills on the floor.
So if the big beautiful bill takes the shape it's currently going to take and it's successful, then we'll get an extension of the Trump tax cuts or some sort of continuation or additional tax cuts consistent with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. And we'll get some additional spending on immigration, national defense. All the other decisions come later in other pieces of legislation and the like. But my sense from reading the reporting is that what should be a relatively easy sell in terms of this reconciliation package has hit all kinds of sort of stumbling blocks along the way. What are those?
Sure. Let's come to the stumbling blocks. One quick thing on the spending, on the discretionary side is we don't know what's going to happen. They write these spending bills, NIH funding, NSF funding, right? All the things, or other programs, US aid, what's going to happen to PEPFAR, all these international global health programs that the Trump administration has slashed and essentially closed down agencies. What's going to happen when Congress refunds those agencies or those programs, puts mandates in the bill? Will the Trump administration listen to that? Or will they just go ahead and one more time go through the cuts again? There may be more court decisions. We don't know at that point, but it's going to upset the whole apple cart on this traditional process of bipartisan legislating on discretionary spending. That's great.
So that means we get to have another episode later, I guess, and talk about whether Trump is going to spend the money that Congress is telling him to spend. All right, so that brings us back to the big beautiful bill and this reconciliation package. What are the challenges that Republicans have faced so far with this?
So I think when political scientists and students at Congress study party control and congressional policy making, everywhere from Mayhew in the 1990s to many others more recently, we look at unified party control, and not Mayhew, but many others think that it might not be a silver bullet or a magic bullet, but big things are more likely to happen with unified party control. Same, we think, roughly similar policy interests within the majority and roughly similar electoral interests of keeping control.
Yeah.
But what we see, and certainly reconciliation is just opening up these fissures so you see it quite clearly, there are at least two sets of divisions. One, bicameral, right? Just because of a Republican House majority and a Senate Republican majority, they don't see eye to eye. They disagreed over almost everything about the structure of reconciliation, although they do agree on extending the tax cuts. But they disagree on how long they should be cut for. So on basic questions here, the House and Senate Republicans, some commonality of interests, but it's not really clear. They are not yet on the same page. So that's the first thing. And we'll come back to like some of the core disagreements here.
Yeah.
Medicaid, oddly enough, is one of them, but we can come
Yeah.
to that. What's the other division here? It seems more pronounced in the House, in part because the Senate hasn't really shown its hand because they're waiting to see what the House does. But that fracture we've seen, you could say it's a couple years old, you could say it's Tea Party driven, you could trace it all the way back to the 1960s, right? The Goldwater versus the establishment. Today, it's the conservatives versus, we might call them moderates, we might call them centrists. I think it's better to call them the Republicans who are from swing districts, right? Oftentimes in blue states, so there's purpley places.
Yeah.
They are not on the same page either. Conservatives really want quite stringent revenues raised in this bill so that the tax bill, well, one rationale explanation is they don't want a tax bill that increases the deficit and adds to debt of $5 trillion. They're not on board for that. The other explanation is they really do want to slash, many people would say, the social welfare net. And so this is their opportunity. The swing district folks are, quite many of them alarmed about the prospects or the optics, either politically or in policy terms, impact on constituents of slashing Medicaid. And also another group, 2030 folks, they don't want to get rid of all the, what we call the IRA sustainable energy credits or research and development on sustainable energy, right? Because businesses in their districts have profited from and used those.
Yeah.
So, and typically, just to keep in mind, we always say that the moderates cave. So that's like the big question here. Like, will conservatives cave? Will conservatives cave? And they just probably have 3-4 vote margin on the floor. So
yeah,
those divisions are shaking things up.
So all this makes Mike Johnson's job fun and interesting.
And he's got a very large Medicaid dependent
yes.
Population in his Louisiana district.
Yeah, so this is the real question. I mean, it's hard to cut Medicare and Social Security because those are entitlement programs for the elderly, viewed as a fairly politically engaged group. Not easy to tell them they're getting less money from the government. But Medicaid, of course, goes to people who meet a government definition of poverty. And that's not a group that I think has the same kind of electoral strength that older citizens typically have, although of course there's some overlap here. But do we think the politics of Medicaid have really changed now that, at least by some statistics, a lot of Republican-leaning districts now have some of the largest fraction of people who depend on Medicaid?
So the key here, I think, and I'm not a policy person, but it does seem the key is what we call Medicaid expansion, which was part of the Affordable Care Act in 2010, right? Originally mandated, Republicans sued, and the Supreme Court said, yeah, you can't mandate expansion, but states could opt into it. And what is remarkable to me is that where we are 15 years after the ACA, 40 states, including some red states, have opted in because of very, very generous federal match, right? Federal government pays 90% of the cost. And why is it expansion, right? It's not just at and below the poverty level. I think it's like plus about 138% of the poverty level. And also it's wrapped in with healthcare for children. So what's happening here? If you look at House members, 60% of them represent districts in states with Medicaid expansion. And so for anyone who, well, nobody really opens up the New York Times. I get it. You go, right. Whatever. I don't want you to think I'm a dinosaur. But Josh Hawley, he's no liberal. He's no progressive, right? Quite conservative. We might even call him MAGA conservative. New York Times op-ed this morning saying, we cannot slash Medicaid, right? And why? Missouri finally in 2020, when 24, when on the ballot, an initiative referendum, and they put it in the Missouri Constitution. So if you slash Medicaid, it's the state of Missouri is going to have to come up with those funds. And so, I mean, Hawley was very specific. He said it's policy, it's bad for Missouri residents, and politically it's really bad if we want to be the party of the working class.
Yeah.
that's like the crux here. Like how seriously and how far do you take that Trump wanting to be move the Republicans to be a party of working class? And you know far better than anyone, like what voters' behavior looks like amongst the white
Right.
working class versus people of color in the working class. So that's like it's so remarkable to me that this Democratic move in 2010, right, landmark establishment on healthcare, and it's come to like permeate and ripple and like seemingly upend
Yep.
Republicans their effort to get those tax cuts.
Yeah, there's a long-standing literature, that's talked about when the welfare state expands, it's really tough to roll back. And that was true in like Margaret Thatcher's Great Britain. That's been true throughout the sort of ascendance of like Reagan conservatives and the like. Instead, we just continue to expand it in a variety of ways, either because like more and more people need it because the population's aging, or just because it's really politically, I think, beneficial to do things like let's include prescription drug coverage in Medicare, or let's make sure that working class people who are not yet at the government's poverty level, but are not that far from it, can actually benefit from this program too. So fiscally, then
Would this be an opportunity to cite E. E. Schatzsnyder?
the political scientist
Policy makes the politics. Okay, go ahead.
The policy makes the politics, and so that's where we are. No, but so from a fiscal standpoint, let me see if I've done the math on this correctly. We're going to cut taxes. We're going to increase spending on programs that the Republicans really care about, like immigration and defense. But we're not going to make major cuts either to entitlement programs, of course, which are a huge chunk of the federal budget, or to a program like Medicaid, which is also a big chunk of money because even some MAGA conservatives don't want to cut it. So basically, if I read, my press releases from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget correctly, or the Congressional Budget Office, same thing, we're going to continue to increase the size of the budget deficit and the national debt. Like this is, which is what happened under Trump's administration the first time, as well as under Biden too, to be clear.
Yep, and Bush for other reasons, and war on terror. With one big question mark here, which is that if the Energy and Commerce Committee in the House is this week going to mark up its version of its responsibilities on the reconciliation, the resolution tells them you will reduce the deficit by at least $880 billion. And Energy and Commerce does energy subsidies and so forth. So it's not all from Medicaid, but there is still a population and a coalition within the Republicans who, under the guise of saying we're going to cut back on waste, fraud, and abuse in the Medicaid program, may yet come up with the savings, right, or cuts of $600 billion, like some very, very large number. And policy experts will question, is that really waste, fraud, and abuse? But politically, it's very useful to Republicans to wrap it up in that package to get the swing district voters to come along with what the conservatives want to do. And that may yet be where we are, and we don't know what the Senate will do or what Josh Hawley will do if it's not really cutting waste, fraud, and abuse.
But the downside risk of that is people come to find out that you weren't really just cutting waste, fraud, and abuse. You were actually just cutting the amount of money that they're able to receive.
Absolutely. And I'm not a student of the literature on administrative burden, right? But some of these efforts of cutting back waste, fraud, and abuse make it really hard and complicated, right? To demonstrate, for instance, you're working. That in itself gets people dropped from the rolls. And does that count as cutting benefits? Most people would say yes. In a political environment, I don't know where Republicans will come down on that.
Yeah, it seems like the opportunity for the Democrats here is not so much because individual voters are going to realize what the government did and punish the government for it. I think it's really hard sometimes for voters to understand exactly what the consequences of policy were for them and who to blame. But it certainly turns it into an easy issue to put into some advertising, which unifies Democrats pretty quickly, which is you cut taxes on the wealthy in order to cut spending for the poor.
And keep in mind the 2017 tax cut from our collective former colleague Chris Warshaw and his public opinion data, as he showed, over 2 decades of major lawmaking, the repeal of the Affordable Care Act effort, And the 2017 tax cuts were really, really deeply unpopular. Now, there are lots of maybe that's because of the polarization of partisanship, but
Right.
either way, it's a yet another opening for Democrats if they can get on the same page and hone in the message as you just said, right? Tax cuts for the wealthy on the backs of the poor.
Yeah, you have a colleague at the Brookings Institute, Vanessa Williamson, who's written on this, and people don't like taxes, like in a general sense, but like more specifically, they're really concerned about fairness, right? The perception that people who don't deserve to have their taxes cut get more money than people who kind of do deserve it. That's to me where I think Democrats can make some hay on this issue, without sounding like they're in favor of just raising taxes for everyone. And I expect them to do that. I think the other thing that I remember from the data about the Trump tax cuts in 2017 was that the Trump tax cuts were less popular than the tax increase that passed under George H.W. Bush that got him in trouble after 1990. And so, to have a tax cut that's less popular than a tax increase is a remarkable feat. And just more generally, I think the challenge for Republicans is, especially amidst all the economic chaos of tariffs and stuff, and with all these seats they have to defend, especially in the House heading into the midterm, like what is the positive agenda that's being viewed relatively favorably? And that's maybe if you watch our last podcast, you talked about the one of the challenge here for Democrats who might seek to obstruct what Republicans are doing is that Republicans weren't actually trying to do a lot, and most of the energy was coming not from Congress but from the executive, which is why we call this show "Where's Congress?" But it strikes me now that there's not much here cooking up in this big, beautiful bill that's going to really give Republicans like a clear political win, even if they're able to get this through. At the very least, it's a package that seems somewhat vulnerable to counterattack. But maybe that's not true. Maybe at the end of the day, people will like it. But it does seem like a potential repeat of 2017.
Yeah, I think they're with the caveat of we don't know where how big or how beautiful the the bill will be.
Right.
But yeah, it's not an automatic plus for the Republicans. And I think like the larger picture here, like they seem to be like some inherent trade-off that they're thinking of in their mind, that the president is going to run with the tariffs, but what we care about is tax cuts. And that's what drives our donors. That's what drives, they think many of their voters. But that's really what motivates Republicans ideologically. Like that's what they keep. Like that's what they keep in concert, like what they still agree on, even given fractions and factions within the Republican Party. So I think from their perspective, tax cuts is how they deliver, as it's been, right? That's what they do when reconciliation is available, just like Democrats use it for expanding the social welfare net.
But Trump did suggest the other day that they could raise taxes on the wealthy if they wanted to, but he didn't necessarily want them to. That seems like a temporary aberration in this Republican Party consensus, which is, he said this before. He said this in the 2016 campaign too, and obviously they didn't follow through on it in 2017 with the bill. But I presume that's not. I mean, that would actually blunt this Democratic attack and maybe make the bill a little bit more, fiscally balanced. But I mean, I assume you agree that there's not a lot of appetite for this in the rank and file within the House or the Senate.
It doesn't appear to be, and it just seems to fit this pattern of Trump is, some criticisms he doesn't seem to care about. I think $400 million jet from Qatar. Only suckers don't take gifts or something like that, right? But he's hyper seemingly attentive to charges that Republicans just want to give the wealthy tax cuts. And so he comes out with this half-hearted, you should do it, you shouldn't do it, you should do it, you shouldn't do it, upper income tax increase on the super wealthy. This morning, there was, the day we're recording, he came up with this executive order claiming it itself would slash prescription drug prices, right? And he thinks that that's going to blunt some Democratic amendments that would be on prescription drugs. So he's all about the headlines in that way, because I don't think he doesn't really believe in much besides tariffs. And so, but Republicans' tax core is an ideology. It's a religious fervor for them. And so, yeah, I don't think they'll do it. That doesn't seem to be on the cards for what's going down through the House Ways and Means Committee this week. So, but who knows with Trump?
So what we'll have maybe for the next episode is some interesting progress on this bill. We can assess what happened, how beautiful it was, and then we got the big questions coming of what is Congress going to do to fund the government, how much, and what kinds of collisions will that create with the Trump administration. Once again, thanks to Sarah Bender for joining me on this episode of Where's Congress? And we'll look to do another one again soon. Thanks, Sarah.
Excellent. Thanks, John.